Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to take a hard look at John F. Kennedy's presidency, really focusing in on his foreign policy decisions. You sent in a compelling article that offers quite a different angle, maybe a more critical perspective than we often hear about his time in office.
Right.
Our goal is to, get to the heart of this analysis and understand what this counter-narrative is really all about.
It's fascinating because when you think of JFK, there's this strong association with progress and a hopeful future.
Yeah, definitely. The Camelot image.
Exactly. But this deep dive into your source material, it explores a viewpoint suggesting his actions on the world stage were driven by a more complex and arguably more conservative set of priorities. It definitely pushes back against that traditional image.
Absolutely. The article we're digging into is Kuzmarov, Liberal Savior Conservative 2024.pdf, and it's a critical examination of Kennedy's foreign policy. It specifically looks at how historians like Oliver Stone, in The Untold History of the United States, and Aaron Good, with his book American Exception, have presented a more liberal interpretation of JFK.
And the author, Jeremy Kuzmarov, is offering a direct challenge to that view. It's quite pointed.
So Kuzmarov's article aims to question this growing tendency to see JFK's administration as some kind of beacon of progressive change, especially in foreign affairs.
That's the core of it. He delves into specific events, policy choices, even the backgrounds of key people in his administration. He builds a case that might genuinely surprise you.
Challenge some assumptions, you mean?
Yeah, definitely challenge some existing ideas about Kennedy's legacy. We're going to be looking closely at the details this article brings to light about his administration's actions and, their underlying motivations.
Okay, so let's dive right into this liberal savior idea that the article tackles head on. It points out that some historians like Stone, Kuznick, and Good, they've argued for a more liberal portrayal of JFK. Good, in particular, suggests Kennedy's presidency was a brief departure from the imperial consensus, and even a serious threat to the American deep state. I mean, that's a pretty significant claim.
It is a very strong claim. And the article immediately raises an important question. How can Kennedy be seen as a threat to the deep state when, as Good himself kind of acknowledges, that very deep state heavily influenced his administration?
How so?
Well, Kuzmarov highlights the striking fact that 26 high-ranking officials in Kennedy's administration had previously worked for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the one known to have funded CIA front operations.
That's the one the article points to. It's a connection you don't often hear about, right?
Not usually, no. So the article suggests that instead of JFK being this outsider fighting the establishment, he was actually quite intertwined with it.
That's the implication. It leads to the argument that it's difficult to believe he genuinely intended to end the Vietnam War or, move away from what the article calls imperialism as a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy.
So a key insight here is that instead of being an outsider fighting the establishment, this article paints a picture of Kennedy as deeply embedded within the very structures he was supposedly challenging.
Precisely. The article challenges the idea of a fundamental shift in direction. Now, it does acknowledge the significance of the 1962 foreign policy speech at American University.
Ah, yes, the peace speech.
Right. A moment that many saw as offering a glimmer of hope for easing Cold War tensions. You probably remember it for its powerful message about the need for peace.
Absolutely. That speech is often held up as a prime example of a more forward-thinking approach to global relations, like a real turning point.
However, the article urges us to consider the limitations it identifies within that very speech. While it contained forward-looking elements, Kennedy also strongly emphasized anti-communist themes. He defended American intervention in places like the Congo. And what's particularly noteworthy, according to the article, is that he criticized a Soviet publication for accusing the U.S. of pursuing world domination through aggressive wars. A criticism, the article implies, might have had some basis in reality.
So the speech, while hopeful on the surface, wasn't a complete break from the Cold War mentality then, still had those undertones.
That's the argument presented, yes. The article points out that even after this speech, JFK continued to strongly affirm his commitment to the Cold War.
Really? How?
Well, it highlights his somewhat, let's say, unenthusiastic response to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's proposal for a non-aggression pact between NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
What did that proposal include?
Things like the possibility of freezing or even reducing defense budgets, withdrawing foreign troops, ideas that you'd think someone eager for a thaw would jump at.
But Kennedy didn't.
His response was cool. according to the source. It doesn't exactly fit the image of a leader rapidly steering towards de-escalation.
The article then introduces another perspective, characterizing JFK as the great counter-revolutionary of the post-war world. It attributes this view to journalist Richard J. Walton.
Yeah, that's a really strong label, isn't it?
Especially when you compare it to how he's being portrayed by someone like RFK Jr. today. Quite the contrast.
It really underscores the significant differences in how Kennedy's legacy is interpreted. Walton's description suggests a leader primarily focused on preventing the spread of communism, maybe at the cost of other considerations.
Which stands in stark contrast to the more recent and perhaps more romanticized portrayals we often see.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about Africa. The article addresses the claim that Kennedy was a supporter of Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese prime minister.
Right, the first democratically elected leader.
But the article contends this contradicts more recent scholarship, specifically mentioning Susan Williams's book, White Malice.
What's fascinating here is the article's nuanced argument. It suggests that while Kennedy might have expressed some level of sympathy for African independence movements, maybe rhetorically,
but in practice,
his deep-seated anti-communism was the primary driving force behind his policies in the region. This led to significant interference in African nations to back leaders who were aligned with U.S. interests.
Regardless of whether those leaders truly served the best interests of their own people.
That's the argument. The priority wasn't necessarily genuine African self-determination, but rather ensuring these newly independent nations didn't fall under Soviet influence or, control their resources in a way that didn't align with American economic interests.
And the article provides some quite specific examples of this interference, doesn't it?
It does. It mentions alleged collusion with mining firms and the CIA to undermine figures like Antoine Gizenga in Congo.
Lumumba's deputy, right?
Yes, and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. Leaders who might have been perceived as too independent or politically leaning in the wrong direction from a U.S. perspective.
Okay. Moving on, the article tackles the idea that JFK's policies were a significant departure from those of his predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah, the whole break from the past narrative.
It challenges this, suggesting that Eisenhower also resisted starting new large-scale wars, pointing to the Suez Crisis as an example where Eisenhower even threatened Israel.
This is a crucial point in understanding the article's overall argument. It's trying to establish a sense of continuity in U.S. foreign policy, a consistent focus on core strategic objectives.
So less than a radical shift, more of a continuation with different tactics.
Perhaps. While Kennedy might have employed different tactics or faced different global circumstances, the fundamental goals, particularly concerning the Cold War, remained largely consistent, according to this analysis.
And the article points out that Kennedy actually intensified efforts against Castro, even while engaging in some limited back-channel diplomacy.
Right, which again complicates the narrative of a major shift towards, say, peaceful coexistence.
The article then delves into the expansion of covert operations and the military buildup under Kennedy. This is pretty striking.
It is. It highlights that he authorized a staggering number of major covert operations, 163, I think it says, in just 3 years.
Which is only slightly fewer than Eisenhower did in his entire 8 years in office.
Exactly. That suggests a real preference for this type of action, this kind of shadow war approach.
It underscores a preference for these less visible forms of intervention.
Definitely. The article also discusses the expansion of special warfare schools and police training programs, which were often instrumental in bolstering regimes friendly to the United States, even if they weren't exactly democratic.
And when it comes to Vietnam, the article paints a very disturbing picture. It describes it as being transformed into a human laboratory for counterinsurgency techniques.
Yeah, that phrase really stands out.
It details the implementation of things like computerized surveillance, the ID card program, the use of chemical warfare agent, orange, and napalm.
Awful stuff.
And the strategic Hamlet program. It even quotes David W. Condé calling Kennedy the war criminal responsible for the war in Vietnam.
That's incredibly strong language.
It really is. It forces us to confront the darker aspects this article highlights.
And it powerfully emphasizes the article's central thesis, that Kennedy was not on a path to avoid major escalation in Vietnam. The article stresses the development and extensive implementation of these very counterinsurgency strategies during his time in office.
The article also directly refutes the idea that Kennedy had limited power, doesn't it?
It does. It portrays him instead as someone who admired James Bond, was fascinated by the U-2 spy plane, and actively championed increased budgets for both the CIA and the military.
And it mentions a significant surge in defense spending under Kennedy, actually surpassing Eisenhower's levels.
Especially for missile systems, right? Even though the U.S. already had a strategic advantage.
Theodore Sorensen is quoted describing it as the most rapid military buildup in American peacetime history.
Which really dismantles the image of a president somehow constrained by forces beyond his control.
The article argues he was very much on board with strengthening American military power and projecting it globally.
That's the picture it paints, yes.
Now, the article shifts its focus to Kennedy's background and early political career, drawing a connection between his conservative foreign policies and his privileged upbringing.
Right. It notes his father, Joseph Sr.'s considerable wealth and influence the Wolf of Wall Street turned ambassador.
And this is where the article explores the potential roots of Kennedy's worldview.
Exactly. It emphasizes the significant role his father played in financing and managing his early political career. It suggests that JFK might have lacked a deeply ingrained set of his own core beliefs in his formative years as a politician. Maybe more ambition than ideology at first.
It mentions his fiscal conservatism and his initial focus on things like veteran housing, but it also points out limitations in his support for labor.
And even his red baiting of a labor representative, which is quite revealing.
His inconsistent stance on civil rights early in his career is also highlighted. The label Dixie's favorite Yankee is mentioned.
Ouch. And Eleanor Roosevelt's rather sharp description of him, what was it? Epitomizing the new managerial elite that has neither principles nor character.
That's pretty harsh.
It is. These details paint a picture of a politician who was perhaps more pragmatic and responsive to existing power structures than driven by a strong ideological commitment in a, let's say, liberal direction.
So the article uses these points to suggest that his later foreign policy decisions weren't a sudden deviation, but maybe a continuation of these underlying tendencies.
That seems to be the argument. The quotes from journalist Victor Lasky calling his legislative performance listless and uninspired, and Joseph Kraft noting his extremely cautious leadership style, they further reinforce this image of his early career.
The article then firmly establishes Kennedy as a Cold Warrior. It emphasizes his support for the 1947 National Security Act,
which created the CIA and the modern national security apparatus.
Right. And it draws a contrast between his strong anti-communism and his father's more isolationist views. It even mentions his critical perspective on FDR's concessions at Yalta.
This is a crucial element of the article's argument. It contends that Kennedy wasn't simply reacting to the Cold War. He was a firm believer in its fundamental principles from early on. Frederick Lodgeval is quoted calling him an original Cold Warrior who made anti-communism his leitmotif even in domestic policy.
And the article details his strong criticism of Henry Wallace, who was advocating for Cold War de-escalation and closing overseas military bases.
Right. Kennedy apparently attacked Wallace quite fiercely for that.
It also notes that when Kennedy criticized Truman's foreign policy, it was usually for not being vigilant enough against the Soviet threat.
Not for being too aggressive, but not aggressive enough.
Exactly. And his tough stance on China, aligning himself with the conservative China lobby and blaming the White House for the failure of our foreign policy in the Far East after the communist victory in '49, that's strongly emphasized too.
All of this contributes to a very clear portrayal, in this article at least, of Kennedy as someone deeply committed to containing communism and projecting American power globally right from the start of his political career.
It really challenges the notion that he was somehow on a different path or questioning the core assumptions of the Cold War.
It certainly does.
The article then moves into what it terms the Kennedy counterinsurgency crusade. It introduces Michael McClintock's view of counterinsurgency as a principal public plank of Kennedy's foreign policy.
Right, this idea that it wasn't just a tactic but a central strategy.
And it discusses Kennedy's apparent fascination with guerrilla warfare and the special forces.
This was indeed a defining aspect of Kennedy's approach, according to the article. Instead of relying solely on massive, conventional warfare, there was a significant emphasis on these smaller, often more covert interventions.
It mentions National Security Action Memorandum 2, which directed the expansion of counter-guerrilla resources.
And Kennedy's personal involvement with the special forces, his insistence on the iconic Green Berets, for example. He seemed quite taken with them.
It also points out the increased funding for paramilitary and subconventional forces, the expansion of special forces personnel.
and the counterinsurgency training provided to both U.S. and foreign military officers. That 1962 Joint Chiefs report mentioning U.S. counterinsurgency training teams operating in 19 countries worldwide, that really highlighted the global scale of this effort.
19 countries. Wow.
And National Security Action Memorandum 124, which established the Special Group on Counterinsurgency, further centralized and coordinated these efforts, targeting countries across Southeast Asia and Latin America.
The article even cites the Philippines campaign against the Hukbalahat movement as a kind of model, right? Emphasizing a combined approach of military action and civic action programs.
Yeah, the iron fist in the velvet glove idea. And Walter B. Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth theory is presented as aligning with this interventionist mindset, the idea that the U.S. could guide nations through development, preventing communist takeovers.
Okay, now we come back to Vietnam, under the heading, Beginning Our Active Participation in the War. The article traces Kennedy's support for involvement in Vietnam all the way back to his visit in 1951.
Which is much earlier than many people realize. What's striking here is the apparent long-term commitment.
It points out his opposition to any negotiated settlement involving Ho Chi Minh after the 1954 Geneva Conference.
Which was supposed to unify the country through elections.
Right. And his support for a Ngo Dinh Diem and the creation of a U.S.-backed client state in South Vietnam, which the article states was itself a violation of the Geneva Accords.
It also highlights Kennedy's role as one of the founders of the CIA-funded American Friends of Vietnam, or AFV.
What was that?
Essentially a lobby group that actively pushed for increased aid to Diem and, according to the article, played a significant role in drawing the U.S. deeper into the conflict.
So propaganda efforts.
Yeah, the AFV's pro-Diem propaganda and the downplaying of the Diem regime's negative aspects like its repression, especially of the Buddhist population, and former Viet Minh members are discussed.
And the article emphasizes that Kennedy's support for Diem was rooted in their shared anti-communism and Catholicism.
That's the connection it draws. It even quotes Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a Kennedy insider, justifying judicious interventions to counter Russian influence, which directly contradicts the idea of Kennedy as anti-imperialist.
The article includes Kennedy's own recorded comments praising Diem shortly before his overthrow.
Which, in hindsight, highlights the historical inaccuracies in Kennedy's assessment of the situation on the ground. He seemed quite out of touch.
And it doesn't shy away from mentioning Kennedy's private comments that reveal a certain prejudice and an imperial way of thinking regarding South Vietnam's leadership.
No, it doesn't pull punches there.
The crucial decision to escalate U.S. involvement from advisors to combat troops. That happened under Kennedy, didn't it?
Well, the definition of advisors became very blurry, and the numbers increased dramatically. The article emphasizes the substantial increase in U.S. troop numbers in Vietnam under Kennedy.
And the use of chemical defoliation, Agent Orange, napalm.
With a reported increase in birth defects as a tragic consequence. It paints a very bleak picture of the early escalation.
The article makes clear that the overthrow and assassination of Diem in late '63 occurred with at least tacit U.S. approval.
Which, it argues, further solidified American commitment to subsequent South Vietnamese governments. We were kind of locked in after that.
It includes Kennedy's own statements shortly before his assassination, indicating his continued commitment to staying in Vietnam and his firm belief in the domino theory.
Yeah, the idea that if Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow.
The planned speech for Dallas, the one who never gave, apparently emphasized military strength and the necessity of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia.
Reinforcing that commitment right up to the end.
Now, what about the ongoing debate about Kennedy's alleged intention to withdraw from Vietnam? That's a big point for some historians.
It is. But the article addresses this directly, noting that even McNamara's supposed withdrawal plans were contingent on achieving U.S. strategic objectives first, basically winning.
So, not an unconditional withdrawal plan.
Not according to this source. It cites Mark Silverstone's 2022 study, which apparently debunks the withdrawal myth, and points out that Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s extensive account of the Kennedy White House made no mention of such plans.
So, while theories linking Kennedy's assassination to a planned withdrawal exist, like L. Fletcher Prouty's,
the article stresses the lack of clear evidence for a complete, unconditional abandonment of South Vietnam. It leans heavily against that interpretation.
Michael Herr's description of Vietnam as a spook war under Kennedy really captures the clandestine nature of the early involvement, doesn't it?
It does. This detailed examination of Kennedy in Vietnam, as presented by the article, leaves little room for the interpretation of him as a leader poised to pull the U.S. out. The emphasis is consistently on escalation, counterinsurgency, and that unwavering anti-communism.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to Laos. The article discusses Kennedy's decision against direct military intervention there,
attributing it partly to the fallout from the Bay of Pigs failure in Cuba.
Yeah.
Maybe your reluctance to launch another big overt operation so soon.
But it also points out the increase in military aid to Laos and the transformation of U.S. advisors into a MAG, a military assistance advisory group.
Right. And the CIA's use of what they called sheep-dipped crews, essentially civilians, often ex-military, operating covertly under CIA direction.
So substituting large-scale overt intervention with a more clandestine approach.
That seems to be the case presented. Despite Kennedy's own criticism of Eisenhower's handling of Laos during the 1960 campaign, the article shows a continuation and even an expansion of covert operations.
Thailand's crucial role as a CIA base for operations within Laos is also highlighted.
Yes, a major staging ground.
The formation of a coalition government under the 1962 Geneva Convention and the agreement for the removal of all foreign troops are mentioned.
But the article quickly turns to Wilfred G. Burchett's account of the U.S. allegedly sabotaging this agreement.
How?
Through the use of these White Star teams, U.S. Special Forces operating secretly, and the continuation of military aid, particularly funneled through Thailand.
And the coalition government itself, it wasn't truly balanced.
The article notes the persistent dominance of Phomi Nosaven's right-wing loyalists within the coalition, despite the neutralist, Suvarnabhumi being prime minister, and the Pathet Lao communists having some roles.
So the Kennedy administration's strategy was to actively undermine the Pathet Lao and neutralist factions.
That's the claim, including, disturbingly, the assassination of Foreign Minister Qunim Fulsena, a neutralist, which the article links to USA by police training programs and the CIA.
And the secret army?
Ah, yes. The CIA's recruitment and training of the Haomon minority as a secret army, led by Von Pao. This effectively bypassed the Geneva Accords entirely.
How was that funded?
The article mentions substantial funding for this MIO operation, as it was called, being channeled through the Agency for International Development, AID, as a cover.
And bombing.
Apparently, the authorization of bombing in Laos occurred shortly before Kennedy's assassination, further illustrating the extensive nature of this secret war. It wasn't peaceful neutrality in practice.
Okay. The article then broadens its view of Southeast Asia, looking beyond Vietnam and Laos under the heading Arch-Imperialistic Foreign Policy.
Catchy title.
It discusses Kennedy's strong opposition to the Maoist revolution in China and his clear desire for U.S. dominance throughout the region.
Recalling his criticism of Truman for losing China.
Right. And his continued support for Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan.
This section really emphasizes the consistent and powerful thread of anti-communism driving Kennedy's policies across all of Southeast Asia, not just Indochina.
His praise of Taiwan's human rights record, despite it being widely seen as a police state then, and his deep-seated fear of China getting nuclear weapons.
That fear seemed quite intense, potentially even considering military action against Chinese nuclear installations, according to the source.
The strategic importance of U.S. military bases in Japan is discussed.
And the CIA's alleged funding of the conservative Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, in Japan,
right,
along with covert operations against Japan's left-wing movements to keep Japan firmly in the U.S. camp.
Kennedy's lecturing of a Japanese audience on containing Chinese communism and his apparent disregard for Okinawan petitions against U.S. bases are also highlighted.
Yeah, the U.S. administration of Okinawa continued under him, despite local opposition.
The encouragement of Japanese economic expansion? Was that linked to the bases?
The article suggests it was partly to help support the costs of U.S. bases in the region, and also involved integrating the South Korean economy more closely with Japan.
And South Korea itself.
The U.S. role in the 1961 military coup that brought Park Chung-hee to power is mentioned. Park was apparently heavily supported by Kennedy.
Described by one source as a mechanized puppet of the CIA. Strong words again.
Very strong. The article emphasizes the continued focus on maintaining crucial beachheads in Japan and the Philippines.
Expanding aid to the Philippines to ensure a continued U.S. military presence there.
And the CIA's instrumental role in the secret war in Indonesia, plus plans to increase military personnel and nuclear weapons on Guam and Saipan. It all points towards a very assertive effort to maintain and expand American power.
What about Indonesia specifically? The article touches on the idea that Kennedy tried to normalize relations with Sukarno.
It does mention that, but contrasts it with what it presents as the underlying strategy. Cultivating alliances with right-wing Indonesian generals and actively fostering a split within Indonesia's powerful Communist Party, the PKI.
Robert Kennedy's visit to Indonesia is mentioned in this context.
Yes, and the subsequent meeting with General Suharto, who would later overthrow Sukarno. Continued U.S. support for anti-communist forces and training of Indonesian police are presented as part of the strategy.
And economic interests.
The article notes the significant American fear of Sukarno, potentially expropriating U.S.-owned rubber and oil companies, as a key motivator.
So, essentially, across Southeast Asia, the article portrays Kennedy's policies as being driven by a very clear objective: contain communism, maintain U.S. dominance, protect economic interests, often through intervention or backing friendly authoritarians.
That's the consistent picture painted in this part of the analysis, yes.
Okay, let's turn to Latin America. The heading here is Inoculating Latin America from Castro-Style Socialism.
Another revealing heading.
It explains that despite Kennedy's relative popularity in the region, his policies were primarily shaped by Cold War anxieties and a willingness to support military takeovers if deemed necessary to counter communism.
The Alliance for Progress is mentioned, of course, the big aid program.
But the article argues its potential was undermined by the overriding focus on counterinsurgency efforts.
Exactly. The pervasive fear of more revolutions like Cuba's and the Kennedy brothers, particularly Robert's almost obsessive focus on removing Fidel Castro through things like Operation Mongoose. That was central.
Mongoose involved paramilitary raids, covert ops, the economic blockade.
A very aggressive stance against Cuba, yes.
So the Alliance for Progress, the article presents it less as genuine development aid and more as a strategic tool.
A tool to immunize Latin America against radical ideologies and the appeal of Cuban-style socialism, as the heading suggests. Keep them in the capitalist U.S.-aligned camp.
The expansion of USAID's police training programs throughout Latin America is mentioned again here.
Yes, and the significant shift in U.S. military assistance from traditional naval power towards internal security forces, armies, and police focused on domestic dissent.
The article contrasts Kennedy with Eisenhower here, suggesting Ike was maybe more comfortable with old-school dictators, while JFK preferred anti-communist reformers.
Reformers who could raise living standards within a free enterprise framework, yeah. Influenced again by Walt Rostow's modernization theory, but still firmly anti-communist.
The CIA's continued active support for anti-Castro Cuban exiles is noted.
And the lingering uncertainty about JFK's personal knowledge of the Castro assassination attempts, though RFK's initial enthusiasm is mentioned.
The article then gives a whole series of specific country examples, doesn't it?
It does. Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Bolivia, Guyana, Colombia, Brazil, Guatemala. It's quite a list.
And the pattern seems consistent. Supporting anti-communist forces, sometimes undermining democratic processes, backing repressive regimes if necessary.
That's the pattern the article lays out, often with U.S. economic interests playing a role too, like Standard Oil in Venezuela or sugar companies in the Dominican Republic.
It also points out Kennedy signing laws that penalize countries not signing investment guarantee agreements.
And generally pressuring Latin American nations to adopt conservative economic policies as a condition for U.S. aid.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s more positive portrayal of the Alliance for Progress is sharply contrasted with Che Guevara's view of it as just another tool of U.S. imperialism.
A stark difference in perspective, highlighting the controversy.
All right, let's move finally to Kennedy's Africa policy, subtitled Economic Interests and Anti-Communism.
Back to Africa, but focusing more broadly now.
It discusses the significant U.S. intervention in the Congo, the DRC, highlighting the strong American support for Cyril Adula over Antoine Gizenga.
And the CIA's alleged role in grooming Adula and ensuring his election through methods like bribery, blackmail, and threats. Pretty damning stuff if true.
The article portrays Adula's government as essentially a puppet regime, highly responsive to General Joseph Mobutu.
The same Mobutu Kennedy apparently praised, despite his role in Lumumba's assassination and his dictatorial tendencies.
Mobutu's close connections with the influential diamond merchant Maurice Templesman are also discussed,
suggesting a potential link between U.S. policy decisions and American economic interests. Diamonds and other minerals in the Congo are incredibly valuable. Templesman's personal relationship with JFK is also mentioned as potentially influential.
Plus, the Rockefeller family's interest in the DRC and Dean Rusk's own connections to the Rockefeller Foundation. Lots of potential conflicts of interest.
It certainly raises questions about the motivations behind the policy.
The discussion then moves to U.S. policy towards Ghana, outlining how it allegedly laid the groundwork for the 1966 CIA-backed coup against Kwame Nkrumah.
Why Nkrumah?
Apparently due to his Pan-Africanist and socialist leanings and his stance on American investments. The Kennedy administration's pressure on him regarding political freedoms and private enterprise and cutting funding for the vital Volta Dam project are highlighted.
So, using economic leverage.
Seems like it. The article further points out Kennedy's reluctance to take significant action against apartheid South Africa, despite some symbolic gestures like a leaky arms embargo.
And backing off from strongly advocating for Angolan independence.
To maintain access to the strategically important Azores military base, controlled by Portugal, the colonial power in Angola at the time, strategic interests trumping liberation.
And the CIA's support for Holden Roberto's FNLA over the more left-leaning MPLA in Angola.
Presented as another example of prioritizing anti-communism above genuine African self-determination, supporting the groups seen as more aligned with U.S. interest, regardless of their nationalist credentials.
Okay, the article concludes its regional analysis with Middle East policy, anti-Sovietism, and oil. No surprises in that subtitle.
Not really. It discusses the continuation of Eisenhower's policy of viewing Israel as a crucial strategic ally against Soviet-backed Arab nationalism.
And the significant amounts of advanced military hardware provided to Israel during Kennedy's tenure.
It also mentions Kennedy's decision to effectively bury a State Department and UN plan for the resettlement of Palestinian refugees.
Under pressure from Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, the article states,
Kennedy is even described in the article, quoting Warren Bass, I believe, as the father of the U.S.-Israeli alliance.
That's a significant claim, highlighting his role in deepening that relationship.
His active courting of the Israeli lobby, AIPAC's endorsement, his private statements about the special relationship, it all points that way.
And the article highlights Kennedy being the first president to break the arms embargo on major weaponry to Israel. Meyer Feldman of AIPAC is noted as a key advisor.
So the article argues his overarching Middle East policy was aimed primarily at minimizing Soviet influence and safeguarding Western access to oil.
That's the main thrust, protecting those twin interests.
The increased assistance to the Iranian gendarmerie and the Shah's secret police, SAVAK, is discussed.
Under the guise of supporting a white revolution, reforms from above to preempt a red revolution from below and protect U.S. interests and the Shah.
The emergency shipment of riot control equipment to Iran after demonstrations in 1963 is noted as evidence of this support.
And the U.S. support for the 1963 Ba'athist coup in Iraq?
Yes, the one that brought Saddam Hussein's party to power initially. The article includes allegations of the U.S. providing lists of suspected communists to the coup plotters.
Chilling, if accurate.
Finally, it highlights the shift towards actively supporting conservative Arab regimes like Saudi Arabia as a counterweight to Nasser's pan-Arabism in Egypt.
Driven heavily by U.S. oil interests, presumably.
The deployment of U.S. military personnel and equipment to Saudi Arabia for its proxy war in Yemen and the CIA's involvement in training anti-Nasser guerrillas, It all fits that pattern.
Charles Freeman is quoted regarding Kennedy's extensive covert operations in Arabia, reinforcing that point.
So the concluding section of the article, titled Seeking the Glory of a Next Augustan Age, kind of brings it all together.
How does it wrap things up?
It discusses how the tragic circumstances of Kennedy's assassination have contributed to a romanticized view of his presidency.
The Camelot myth again?
Right.
What might have been.
Right, but it points out a 1962 protest by UC Berkeley students who were already criticizing Kennedy for increased military spending, actions against Cuba, support for dictatorships, and his tepid stance on civil rights. So not everyone was buying the image even then.
Interesting. A contemporary critique.
It references Robert Frost's poem from the inauguration, suggesting it hinted at imperialistic ambitions.
How so?
I think the line about a next Augustan age suggesting a period of American dominance. The article ultimately concludes that Kennedy was, in its view, a highly effective imperialist.
Effective why?
Due to his charisma, his oratory, his heavy reliance on covert operations, and his ability to inspire patriotic fervor for the new frontier and the American century, he made interventionism seem appealing.
So a critique not just of the policies, but of how skillfully they were pursued and presented.
Exactly. So to bring it all together, this deep dive into the article you shared really presents a perspective on JFK's presidency, especially foreign policy, that challenges many of the common, often more positive narratives.
Yeah, it's definitely a counter-narrative. We've explored arguments suggesting his policies were deeply rooted in Cold War imperatives, a really strong and consistent anti-communism.
And the unwavering protection of American economic and strategic interests across the globe.
Perhaps even more so than in a genuine pursuit of liberal ideals, or representing a significant break from the policies of his predecessors, Eisenhower particularly.
What's particularly revealing, I think, is how this critical perspective highlights the inherent complexities and, frankly, contradictions within Kennedy's historical legacy.
Absolutely. It becomes clear that his time in office remains a subject of ongoing and often sharply contrasting historical interpretations.
And the sources you provided offer a particularly critical lens, don't they? Shedding light on actions and underlying motivations that often remain outside of mainstream popular memory.
Hopefully, this deep dive has offered you, our listeners, some surprising insights and maybe a more nuanced understanding of this pivotal period in American history.
We really encourage you to continue reflecting on these points as you further explore this era. What aspects of this analysis stood out to you the most?
And what new questions does this raise for you regarding the fundamental nature of American foreign policy during the long and often turbulent years of the Cold War?
This analysis leaves us with a final, perhaps provocative thought to consider.
Considering this perspective, how does it fundamentally reshape your understanding of the so-called Camelot era and its lasting impact on American foreign relations in the decades that followed?
Was the pursuit of a next Augustan age truly a glorious and ultimately beneficial ambition for the United States and the world?
Or did it inherently carry within it contradictions and unintended consequences that, well, we are still grappling with and trying to understand fully even today?